Hello, this is Sheila Bender, and you are listening to In Conversation, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today we have with us Jonathan Thomas Stratman. He is a novelist and filmmaker who grew up in Alaska and has since lived in the Pacific Northwest, including 15 years, until 3 years ago, in Port Townsend. He has since moved to Eugene, Oregon. He has written 7 novels and also published a short story in ebook form, and he has an 8th novel on the way. These novels, whether for middle grade readers or adults, richly recreate the core old-time Alaskan adventure and experience. They range from coming-of-age adventure to quirky, richly nuanced adult characters with enough plot turns and twists to keep you up after your bedtime. Welcome to the program, Jonathan.
Thank you. It's great to be here talking to you.
I'm glad you are. I'm glad you're familiar with Port Townsend. And we have a lot to talk about because you have a rich experience in filmmaking and in writing many, many books. So let's just start with something that is of interest to me always, is how does a person transition, in this case you, into writing novels from a life where you weren't doing that?
It took a long time. I was a cricket author back in the late 70s, and things that turned out as chapters in books later, I originally published as freestanding short stories in cricket. And during that time, one of the cricket editors said to me, "This should be a book." That's wonderful to hear. You think, oh yeah, this should be a book. But I started out writing short. I've been a guitar player all my life, and the first things I wrote were songs, where you do the whole plot turn, 16 lines and a chorus or whatever. And so the idea of going from a short story to a novel, frankly, baffled me it was 20 years from the time the editor said, this should be a book, until it was a book. So the question is, how did I get from the one spot to the other? And it's interesting to me anyway. I had been teaching. I taught junior high and taught at Olympic at night. I wanted to write. I had taught for 10 years, and I just wanted to write, and frankly, I didn't care what I wrote in those days. I wanted to be paid. I wanted to make a living as a writer, and so I ended up at Eddie Bauer. I quit teaching, and I got hired there on the strength of some newspaper features and my fiction. The editor there said, "I can see that you can write, and I'll try you. I'll take a chance." And so I started out writing catalog. And why this is important is that you come in day after day, and I ended up doing this at Eddie Bauer and other advertising agencies for 10 or 12 years, and you come in every day to an empty piece of paper or an empty screen, and you sit down and you start writing. And it doesn't matter if you stayed up late, and it doesn't matter if you're not feeling well, and it doesn't matter if you don't like the product particularly. You fill the page. You do something that your editor says, yeah, okay, this will work, and they give you a check. And the beauty is, later on when you're working for yourself, and actually I had a chance to interview Aaron Elkins years ago, and the question you always ask writers is, what about inspiration? And he said, well, I get inspired every morning at 9. And so that, with the writing muscle that I built up doing advertising, has worked well for me. I come down every morning between about 6 and 6:30, sit down in the chair, and even if I didn't know what I was going to write when I was at the top of the stairs, my fingers know by the time I get set down with a cup of coffee and start to type.
So you trust your fingers.
For a first draft, anyway.
Yeah. All right. I really love learning about that and how you got paid to be a writer of copy for catalogs for Eddie Bauer, and that led to a certain discipline that helped you continue to write. How did you find a way to go from writing short for kids for the magazine Cricket to writing longer for older kids and for adults? How did you leap that gap?
It's related. My wife and I did a video series. We were video producers. And the first project that we came up with and got a little bit of funding for was to do a series called The Writer at Work. I sent a letter to Ray Bradbury, and a little while after that I was having lunch with a friend, and he said, "Bradbury's dead." And I said, "Oh, I just sent him a letter," and I felt really stupid. This was quite a while ago, actually. And then a couple of days later, my phone rings, and I pick up the receiver, and a voice says, "This is Ray Bradbury." I have everything I can do to not say "in a pig's eye." And I said, "Well, I'm really glad I'm hearing your voice because a friend told me that you were dead." And he said, "Oh, yeah, I get that all the time." He said, "They get me mixed up with Gene Roddenberry, who actually was dead."
Ah.
He said that Roddenberry and he had an agreement that they would go to each other's funerals and that he had gone to Roddenberry's, but Roddenberry hadn't gone to his yet. So anyway, I digressed with that to tell you that one of the things he said when we were talking was that he writes a sentence and then he writes the next one. And he doesn't, and I don't know where the story is going. Like Elkins, Aaron Elkins, when he writes a mystery, he's pretty much got it plotted. He knows where it's going. But I don't. I write the sentence or the paragraph or even the chapter and then ask myself, what happens? What can happen? What might happen? The one variance is that sometimes when I start a book, I have what I call a gag. In films, a gag is a stunt often. But I think of a gag as a piece of physical action that makes the reader say, "Oh, what's going to happen now?" Like I had a couple of my characters tied to anchors and dumped into Eagle Harbor in one of the books. And that was actually the first part of the book that I figured out. I had to figure out how to get them dumped in, and then I had to either figure out how to get them out or have a really short book.
So was this an adult book?
Oh, yeah.
That was one of your mysteries. Yeah.
Yeah.
So can people still find the film you made, the video, on Writers at Work?
I don't think so. It was a really wonderful idea. Oh, by the way, Bradbury declined, but we did have some very good people. We had Elkins and Chance and Earl Emerson. We went to New Mexico and taped Tony Hillerman and went to New England and taped Jane Yolen.
Wow.
But that was back in VHS days and I-8 days, and the masters just look really terrible.
Oh. Well, your story about being inspired actually by Ray Bradbury and his way of sharing what he did, which was to write one sentence and you write another, is very valuable. And that was a really wonderful contact for you and now for us, because you've told us that story. So thank you very much. I wanted to talk to you about your middle grade books on Amazon, which is where I went to see all the book covers, and also to your website, which, by the way, for listeners, is Jonathan Thomas Stratman, which is where you blog, actually. So that would be JONATHANTHAMASSTRATMAN.blogspot.com.
That's it.
Right. We can also find your books on your Amazon author page by just looking it up with Jonathan Stratman. You have said that the books that you've written, even for adults and middle grade kids, are ones that exploit, let's say, your history of living in Alaska before it was a state. Just before we went into our taping, we decided that Alaska became a state in about 1959. So you had maybe a decade and a year plus being in Alaska before it was a state. And I'm just wondering how kids today who have never known a frontier state and have digital lives, how do they respond to your book?
There are two answers. We have a grandson named Zane who is a gamer, and I think part of the answer is if he's ever cracked one of my books, I don't know about it. But there's a whole other group of kids, believe it or not, who are more active, people that ski and hike and snowshoe and bike and are a little more active. And I have solid readership. You know, the other thing, I'll digress, is that I always think that I'm writing for boys. Really what I'm trying to write is what I like to read. Mm-hmm. But I have a lot of girl readers. And the other thing with that Chichaco series is they're often read aloud in classes, for example, down as low as about third grade. I get notes from teachers, and they're good read-aloud books because no matter who the kid is sitting there in fifth grade listening to the teacher read, when the teacher is ready to stop, they'll often say, "Oh, read a little more," which is a really wonderful thing. The other thing is that Chichaco is well-rated for reluctant readers, kids who can read but don't want to because they have something else going on. And I got a note from a teacher in Vermont that said what she called her lovable lunkheads, that when they had the chance to go somewhere else and do something else, would stay behind in class to read ahead, and that some of them had sneaked to read ahead, which I think is really the highest compliment.
Absolutely.
So the answer to your question is, I think there are some kids that probably don't look at the books, but there's a hardcore of others. The other thing about the Chichaco books, and people mention it, is that they're clean. There aren't any swear words, and there aren't any of the things that upset people in a lot of books, which works well for me. I sell pretty well, even though nobody really knows who I am.
Can I ask you about the word series? So the book we're discussing is one of a series, and that piques my interest. How do you know that you have more to say after you've finished one of the books? Because how many are in the series now?
In the Chichaco series, there are 3. The first is Chichaco. The second is Float Monkeys. And the third is Musher. And I kind of have a fourth that I've been walking around with. Actually, I like to walk. A lot of times these books flesh out, at least in my head, when I'm walking. And I think that the fourth book is going to have something to do with a sunken treasure ship in southeast Alaska, the Neva.
So how many of the characters repeat in the books?
The 2 boys and the dog repeat in every book, and it's turning out that I have kind of a northern cast. The stories take place in 2 parts of Alaska, mostly in the interior near Fairbanks, where it's really cold and really snowy. But Float Monkeys and the fourth book will take place in southeast Alaska near Sitka, more of a maritime with islands and rain.
So how old are these boys?
Oh, I never say. In my head, they're probably about 9th grade.
And they are just independent enough to get around to different parts of Alaska.
I set up ways for them to plausibly get off on their own a little bit.
Can you give us an example of a way that you've set something up to be plausible?
Well, in Float Monkeys, for example, the protagonist in that series is Will, and his uncle or step-uncle has a flying service in southeast Alaska. So something happens that he needs a float monkey, which is actually a name I made up, but later found out that they call these dock boys and girls. I heard a pilot say he called them float apes or dock apes or something like that. So I accidentally hit it well anyway. So they get to go off in this sort of semi-supervised situation in which they're actually not really supervised at all and have adventures.
That sounds great.
You are listening to KPTZ 91.9 FM, Port Townsend. In case you just joined us, you are listening to In Conversation with Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today, Sheila is talking with Eugene, Oregon author Jonathan Stratman about his novel series that makes pre-state Alaska come alive for middle grade and adult readers.
I know that the title of the book that's forthcoming is Raft, and you mentioned that was a one-off, meaning I think that it's not part of a series?
That's correct.
So is it something like this next book in your series is Brewing as you walk, and this other novel just came to you separately, so that's why you don't think it's a series?
I think I tell the whole story that there is to tell in the one book, and I've missed that character in that setting. I wrote it to be kind of a complete piece, and I want to leave it that way. That was interesting because 2 things. I carried 2 images with me for a long time. When I was a boy in Nenana, not a kid that I knew well, but a kid that I knew, because you knew everybody in Nenana, drowned. He was probably epileptic. I'm not sure. This is my understanding from a age 10 point of view. And he went out in the water and probably passed out and died. I saw his body. They brought him to the Quonset hut there at the church. My dad was the Episcopal priest, and laid him out there, and then they came to wash him later. And I looked in the window, and I saw him laying there. I wasn't horrified or any particular thing, but the image stayed with me for all this time. Although this won't seem to combine, when we were doing video, we did a lot of United Way stuff. And one that particularly again, stayed with me was a man who was 55 and had gotten into an adult literacy program because at 55 he still couldn't read. And he had managed to conceal that all through school and all through every job he'd ever had. And I said to him, how can you do that? He said, oh, there are lots of ways. If somebody wants to read me something, I say, well, you read it. I forgot my glasses or whatever. He had a whole arsenal of ways to avoid reading, and it had worked for him. And I got thinking about the situation of a boy, again, about the same age. The assumption with middle grade 7, 8, 9 is that they'll read up at least one grade. So I have to make sure that my kids don't ever get any higher than maybe 10th grade and try to stay below that. Anyway, this fella, I started thinking about a life where a boy who can't read creates this artificial way of getting by based on his friendship. And then the boy dies, his friend dies. And of course, he not only can't interpret anything, he's lost his only friend. He's just completely thrown to the wind. And so that was kind of the genesis of that notion.
I like that story. It's very much how writers think, isn't it? That things are layered one on top of the other until a whole new version of human experience comes through. Thank you. I hope you've prepared something you can read to us, an excerpt from one of your books.
I have. I've got a section from Raft, and
thank you.
I've timed this. I think we're in the groove or close.
Great.
The protagonist, the boy who can't read, is Charlie Sutton. And as I said, he's made a secret of the fact that he can't read. And by the way, nowadays it would be harder to get all the way through high school, but I set the story in 1953 when those kinds of diagnoses were a little more slipshod to make the story more likely. He's gotten away with this with the help from his one and only friend, Ozzie. And then when Ozzie dies suddenly, Charlie's life turns upside down. So now Charlie's out by himself, slumped on a log. He stared out at the water and the far shore. Then, remembering the book in his hands, he began to whack it aimlessly on a branch stub protruding from the log in front of him. Whack, whack. Don't do that. Whatever you're pissed about, it's not the book's fault. Distracted, he hadn't noticed Emmy coming to sit behind him, just like in class, until she spoke. You don't know anything, he said, and then, it's not your book. She considered, but only briefly. I know your friend died and you feel like crap. Now you got to figure out a whole bunch of new ways to make people think you can actually read that book. Charlie froze mid-whack. She said it out loud. She not only knew he couldn't read, she spoke the words. No one ever had, not even Ozzie. He gave the book another whack. She slid across to his log and reached out her hand, clasping the book, not taking it, but stilling it. It's not the book's fault, she repeated. Maybe you should consider whacking your own head. It was the cruelest thing she could have said. She saw that instantly. He let go of the book, leaving her holding it, and bending from the waist began to whack his forehead on the same log, though not on the limb end, she noticed. It had to hurt. He had his eyes closed, so it startled him after the third whack, when his head hit not the hard log, but her soft palm. Instead of drawing back, he left his forehead there, resting. It was the first time she'd touched him or any boy, except maybe to strike a blow. It jolted her. I'm sorry, she said. When he sat up, the day looked different. She pulled her hand back and tried to give him his book, but he waved it away. I can't do anything with it. Maybe kill spiders. I take them outside, she said. He'd never sat with a girl before, and more significantly, a girl never sat by him. He could feel her slight warmth along his side. Just as he turned to look at her, she turned to look at him. He wanted to look away, but didn't. He made himself keep looking, as she did. He saw her chapped lips and chopped hair, sunburn and freckles. her mouth forming a flat pink line. But it was her eyes that caught and held him. She had pale green eyes that blinked slowly, not too often. Like looking into a pool in a stream. She could make out a submerged complication of brown and an imprint like a flower, with the black pupil at its center. He was left with a larger sense of having looked inside her, not to see more, but to know more was there. Emmy saw blue eyes, nearly gray and hard as stone, infused with a webbing of silver like distant crackling lightning. She saw squint lines. He squinted all the time, etched around his eyes by sun and wind, giving his eyes an older look than the rest of him. Even at rest, they had the jumpy quality of a jay she fed on the float, interested but flighty, ready to hop, ready to flee. He blinked frequently and quickly. She saw the bump of his broken nose and knew about it, hit with the boom sailing, and his lips looked thin, chewed. Even now the lower lip caught, held by upper teeth. "I liked your story," she said, and he smelled the juicy fruit again. "My story?" And that was when they looked away to the water and the sky, a tugboat inching a long boom out of the cove, about sailing away on your raft. "Oh," he said, "that story. That was our plan this summer, to build the raft and sail out, or motor out if we could find one. Guess that's dead, too. You could still do it." "By myself?" She didn't answer at first. "I could help," she said, after the long silence. "We could do things together, but more like partners. To sweeten the deal," she said. "And I'll read you this." She held up the book. "I'll read you whatever it is you're trying to do until you can do it. Just think about it." "Okay," he said, lying.
Well, thank you for reading that part from the novel that's going to be available. Do you have any idea when it will be published?
We're most of the way through the copy editing, I think. I'm looking at early fall, I believe.
Uh-huh. Well, that's not too long, the way time flies, and we'll be able to read it and find out what happens with their new partnership. It's very moving to listen to a story about one door closing and another opening, and how sometimes close friendships, really meaningful ones, are forged at a time when one party is really in need. It'll be fun to follow these two.
It was fun to write because they both are in that situation. Neither of them have a friend. They're both very lonely and kind of willing to try this thing.
Yeah, that's good motivation. So if someone were to come to you and say, how do I start writing for middle grade kids? I'm a teacher of them, or I'm a children's librarian, or I love reading these stories to my kids. I think I have a story to tell. What would you tell them?
You probably do this too. You go to a book show or something, and people always come up to you and tell you that they're gonna write this. They're gonna get the time, or they're gonna something. So the first thing, and this feels like it's not a direct answer to your question, but really the most important thing is to create the habit of writing. To get to your chair, McKinley Cantor, the guy that wrote The Voice of Bugle Ann, said, somebody asked him, and he said, "Put your butt in the chair," which is what you have to do. This thing of waiting till you're inspired, people do it. I mean, and it works sometimes, but for most of us, we have to be in the chair and we have to be ready to write. And the other thing that you have to do, you have to start with something that interests you. Years ago when I was teaching, and I said the thing that writing teachers always say, write what you know. And I had an 8th grader stick his hand up and say, "Yeah, but I don't know what I know." And they get confused because they think what they know is what they learned in school. And what you know is the way I used to walk through the boatyard there in Port Townsend and other boatyards. I mean, my whole big chunk of my life I've been walking through boatyards, and you smell the oakum and you smell the salt and you hear the gulls. And maybe that's what you know. Each person knows what they know something. They know the way a trail feels under their feet, and then they start thinking about what might happen if they went down that trail. Or sometimes a story comes from something you read or saw that you kind of liked but didn't quite like. You wanted a different ending. And so you can set up a situation where you get to end it the way you want to end it. That's a powerful motivator for some people.
So it sounds like not only do we have to keep appointments with ourselves to sit somewhere where we can write, but the walking is playing a big part in your writing. You referred to it earlier when you said you get ideas. Walking, you've been walking through boatyards. I think there really is something to the physical aspect of generating creativity. I know two things. One is one of my teachers, most of my male poet teachers played basketball. It was really important to them, and there was something about the rhythm of the dribbling that inspired. And also, Rollo May, who wrote The Courage to Create, says in that book that inspiration or the insight comes in moments between hard work and play. That when you switch gears, something goes on in you. So I like that you're telling us to sit, and I also like that you're telling us to do something physical, which in your case is walking, because there is rhythm and sights and feels, like you said, the ground under your feet. So all of that's really of a piece, but we often forget about the sitting down part and keeping appointments with ourselves.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. And I should add, I've gotten some really good ideas. I don't do it so much anymore because I dress differently, but I used to iron clothes, iron a shirt, iron pants, and I got some really good ideas ironing because you're just standing there with your arm moving and creating order from disorder, and your brain is free to come up with what it will.
You know, I really like that phrase, creating order from disorder, because that is the writer's task, and it's really scary because our creative minds seem disordered. So you're saying if you can make your body do something in the world that's tangibly ordering, then your mind is freer and less burdened.
Seems to help.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Do you have any other tidbits?
I never know what I have until I hear them coming out of my mouth.
All right. Well, so many good ones came out of your mouth today. And I want to thank you so much for joining us. It's been a wonderful conversation, and thank you for sharing from your forthcoming book, Raft.
It was my pleasure.
In Conversation is produced by Sheila Bender and edited by Charlie Fleischman.